On May 1st, 1994, at approximately 2:17 in the afternoon local time, Ayrton Senna da Silva's Williams-Renault FW16 left the track at the Tamburello curve of the Autodromo Enzo Edino Ferrari in Imola, Italy, struck the concrete barrier at approximately 211 km/h, and the man widely considered the greatest Formula One driver who ever lived was clinically dead before the rescue team reached the car. He was 34 years old. He had won 3 world championships. He had just been elected by his peers, the other drivers, as the president of the Grand Prix Drivers Association, a safety organization he had revived specifically because he believed the sport was becoming too dangerous. He had a flight booked to return to Brazil the following week. His sister Viviane later said he had been talking, in the days before Imola, about what he wanted to do after he retired from racing. The future did not arrive. Before we continue this story, don't forget to subscribe to our channel, History of Drivers TV, so you won't miss the next videos about legendary drivers from the golden era of motorsports, from the 1940s and beyond. Now, let's continue. That Sunday, approximately 300 million people around the world were watching the San Marino Grand Prix on live television. They watched the car leave the track. They watched it hit the wall. They did not know what they had just seen. Neither did the commentators. It would take several hours and a press conference at a hospital in Bologna for the world to understand that the broadcast had carried something that live television is almost never asked to carry: a man's last moments. The story of how Ayrton Senna got to that wall in Imola begins in São Paulo, Brazil in 1960. And it begins with a family that had money, a city that was exploding, and a boy who could not, by his own account and by his mother's, do the simplest things other children did without difficulty. Ayrton Senna da Silva was born on March 21st, 1960, at the Hospital Israelita Albert Einstein in the Morumbi neighborhood of São Paulo. In the United States that same year, Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho was in theaters. Elvis Presley had just returned from military service in West Germany and reclaimed the top of the charts, and the average price of a new house was $12,600, roughly $130,000 in today's money. America was prosperous, suburban, and consumed with its own reflection. São Paulo was none of those things. It was the fastest growing city in the Western Hemisphere, a grinding diesel-soaked industrial metropolis of 4 million people that had doubled in size in a single decade, where factories ran 24 hours a day and the roads could not keep pace with the cars that jammed them. The city smelled like exhaust and ambition. It was not a place most Americans in 1960 had any reason to think about. The family Ayrton was born into was not poor. That distinction matters because the myth that grew around him sometimes obscured it. His father, Milton Guirado Theodoro da Silva, owned a working farm in Tatuí, in the interior of São Paulo state, and was a partner in Metalurgica Senna, a metal parts manufacturer that employed hundreds of workers and supplied the Brazilian automotive industry. Milton was a businessman in a city where the automotive industry was the dominant engine of growth. The family lived in Santana, a solid middle-class neighborhood in the northern zone of São Paulo, and later moved to a larger home in the Brooklyn Paulistano district in the south, a move that tracked the family's rising economic position precisely. Ayrton's mother, Neida Joana Senna da Silva, ran the household. His older sister, Viviane, was 3 years his senior. His younger brother, Leonardo, came after. By Brazilian standards of 1960, the Da Silva family was comfortable, stable, and going in one direction, up. What Milton da Silva gave his children, beyond financial security, was an obsession. He was a man who loved cars the way some men love music, viscerally, without explanation. When Ayrton was 7 years old, Milton put him behind the wheel of a small cart on the family property. This is documented in multiple sources, including Tom Rubithon's biography of Senna, and it is the origin point of everything that followed. The boy who had trouble with coordination, who struggled with certain subjects in school, who by his mother Nadi's own account was not always the sharpest or most coordinated child by conventional measures. That boy sat in a cart for the first time and discovered that the rules were different here. This is the detail that recurs in every account of Senna's early life, and that tends to get smoothed over in the legend. He was not, as a young child, remarkable by ordinary standards. Nade described coordination difficulties. The boy himself, in interviews years later, acknowledged that learning was not always easy for him. The picture that emerges from the documented record is not of a prodigy who instantly mastered everything around him, but of a child who found, in one very specific and very mechanical context, that his brain worked differently. In a cart, the coordination that lagged elsewhere seemed to operate by different rules. Whether that was neurological, psychological, or simply the alignment of an unusual talent with an unusual activity is not something the record resolves. What the record does confirm is that from age 7 onward, Ayrton Senna da Silva spent every available hour around carts and engines, and that his father, far from discouraging it, built and maintained that world for him. Brazil in the 1960s and 70s was a country that produced racing drivers the way the American Midwest produced quarterbacks, with a specific cultural weight attached to success. 3 Brazilian drivers had already made marks in Formula One before Senna. Emerson Fittipaldi, who won the World Championship in 1972 and 1974, and Nelson Piquet, who would win his first title in 1981. In São Paulo, in a household where the father owned a metalworking company and loved cars, these were not distant figures. They were evidence that the path existed. By the time Senna was in his mid-teens, karting had moved from a hobby on the family property to a serious competitive pursuit. He raced in Brazilian karting championships through the late 1970s, and the results were consistently strong. But Brazilian karting, even at its highest level, was not the world stage. To find out what he was actually worth as a driver, he would have to leave São Paulo, leave Brazil, and go to Europe, specifically to England, where the lower formulae of single-seater racing served as the intake pipe for Formula One. In 1980, Ayrton Senna da Silva left Brazil for England. He was 20 years old. In the United States that same year, Raging Bull was in theaters, and the cable television industry was just beginning to pull American audiences away from the 3 networks. A gallon of gasoline cost $1.25, the equivalent of approximately $5 today, and the country was in the middle of an inflation crisis that had made ordinary expenses feel uncertain and frightening for millions of American families. In England, Senna arrived in a country in its own economic difficulty, rented modest accommodation in Norfolk, and began racing in Formula Ford. The entry level, the bottom rung, the place where young drivers from everywhere in the world converged to eliminate each other. He was far from home, in a country whose language he spoke with difficulty, driving on circuits he had never seen, against drivers who had been racing in England for years. He won. Not occasionally. Consistently, decisively, and in a way that the people running the series said they had not seen before. In 1981, he won the British Formula Ford Championship and the Formula Ford Festival at Brands Hatch. In 1982, he moved to Formula 3 and won the British Formula 3 Championship in 1983. Those who watched him in those years, mechanics, rival drivers, team owners, described not just speed, but something harder to quantify. An ability to extract performance from a car in conditions, particularly in rain, that left other talented drivers simply trying to survive. The rain laps at Donington, the qualifying sessions where he set times that seemed to belong to a different category of driver. These are documented in the records of those championships and in the accounts of people who were present. He was not simply fast. The data said something more specific. He was fast in the places where fast should have been impossible. In 1984, Ayrton Senna entered Formula One with the Toleman team. He was 24 years old. He had left São Paulo 4 years earlier as a young man from a comfortable family with a talent that hadn't yet been tested at the highest level. He arrived in Formula One as a driver who had broken every series he had entered. The question was no longer whether he belonged. The question was how far he would go and how fast. The answer came faster than almost anyone anticipated, and it came with a cost that no one at the beginning of 1984 was positioned to calculate. But the version of Ayrton Senna's story that starts with the championships and the speed and the circuits, that version leaves out the only part that actually explains what happened at Tamburello on May 1st, 1994. On the morning of May 1st, 1994, Ayrton Senna da Silva was at the peak of everything he had built. 3 world championships, 65 pole positions, 41 race wins, a fortune estimated at between $300 and $400 million. A name that, in Brazil, was not spoken the way you speak an athlete's name. It was spoken the way you speak the name of someone who belongs to the country itself. To understand what was lost at Tamburello that afternoon, you have to go back. Not to the crash, to the beginning of what he became. Ayrton Senna da Silva was born on March 21, 1960, at the Hospital Israelita Albert Einstein in the Morumbi neighborhood of São Paulo, Brazil. He was the middle child of 3. His father, Milton Guirado Theodoro da Silva, was a successful industrialist. He owned a metalworking company called Metalúrgica Senna that manufactured auto parts and employed hundreds of workers. He also owned a farm in Tatuí, in the interior of São Paulo state. The family was wealthy by any Brazilian standard of the era. They lived first in Santana, a solid upper-middle-class neighborhood in the northern zone of São Paulo, and later moved to a larger house in Brooklyn, in the southern zone, as the business continued to grow. São Paulo, in 1960, was already the largest city in South America. It was a city that ran on industry and ambition, where the smell of manufacturing and exhaust was constant, where the traffic was already legendary. Milton da Silva loved cars. When Ayrton was 7 years old, his father built him a small kart with a single-cylinder engine rated at 1 horsepower. That is documented. 1 horsepower. The boy drove it around the family property and immediately wanted to go faster. That detail matters because of what came next. Ayrton Senna had coordination problems as a child. His mother, Nady, confirmed it in interviews. He struggled with motor skills below the average for his age. There were learning difficulties in certain school subjects. The child who would become the most precise driver in the history of Formula One was, at age 7, a boy who had trouble with his hands and his balance. What the kart did to that boy, what it gave him in terms of focus and physical integration, is one of the documented facts of his biography that his family returned to repeatedly. By the time he was 13, he was competing in kart races around São Paulo. By the time he was 17, he was a national kart champion. The coordination problems were gone, or rather, they had been replaced by something the opposite of a problem. In 1981, at age 20, Senna moved to England to race in the lower Formula Series. He left a life of comfort, a wealthy family, a country that already treated him as a future star, to live in a modest apartment in Norfolk, cooking his own meals, driving himself to circuits in a van. He was already married at that point to Lilian de Vasconcelos Souza, a Brazilian woman he had wed in 1981. The marriage lasted less than 2 years. The racing did not leave room for much else. He won the British Formula Ford Series in 1981. He won the British Formula 3 Championship in 1983, in a season so dominant, twice as many wins as his closest rival, that the Formula One teams began paying serious attention. Toleman, a small British constructor, signed him for the 1984 season. That was his first year in Formula One. He was 24 years old and completely unknown outside of motorsport circles when the 1984 season began. That spring, the #1 song in the United States was Jump by Van Halen. A movie ticket in America cost roughly $3.50. the equivalent of about $11 today. The country was in the middle of the Reagan years, the economy was recovering, and the dominant story in American sports was the Los Angeles Lakers, who would win the NBA championship that June. Formula One was a European sport, largely invisible to most Americans. What Senna did in Monaco that May of 1984, his first Monaco Grand Prix, was seen by almost no one in the United States in real time. He was driving a Toleman, the slowest competitive car on the grid. It was raining. By lap 31 of that race, Senna had passed car after car in conditions so dangerous that multiple drivers had already crashed or retired. He was closing in on Alain Prost, the race leader, at a rate of 2 to 3 seconds per lap. Then race director Jackie Ickx red-flagged the race, citing dangerous conditions. The race was stopped. Prost was declared the winner. Senna was classified second. People who watched that race, the engineers, the team directors, the other drivers, said afterward in documented interviews that they had never seen anything like what he was doing in those conditions. He was 24 years old, driving an inferior car in the rain, and was on the verge of winning a Grand Prix he had no business winning on paper. By 1987, he was at McLaren. By 1988, driving the McLaren MP44 with Honda turbo power alongside Alain Prost, he had the dominant car in the sport. That season, 1988, the McLaren team won 15 of 16 races. Senna won 8 of those 15. He won his first world championship that year. He was 28 years old. Here is what 1988 looked like in broader terms. Rain Man won the Academy Award for Best Picture. Michael Jackson was on his Bad World Tour, selling out stadiums across the United States. George H.W. Bush was elected president that November. A gallon of gasoline in America cost approximately 90 cents, the equivalent of roughly $2.50 today. And in Europe, on Sunday afternoons, Ayrton Senna was putting his McLaren in positions that the laws of physics said were not available. He won the championship again in 1990 and 1991. 3 titles in 4 years. His pole position record, 65 total across his career, stood for nearly 2 decades after his death. His qualifying laps, particularly the lap he put in at Monaco in 1984 and another at Jerez in 1990, are still studied by engineers as technical documents, not just as athletic achievements. The money followed the success. By the early 1990s, Senna was earning approximately $25 million per year from racing contracts alone, a figure that, adjusted for inflation, translates to roughly $55 million in today's terms. His total fortune at the time of his death was estimated at between $300 and $400 million. He owned property in Brazil and in Europe. He maintained a home in São Paulo and a house in Angra dos Reis, the coastal resort town in the state of Rio de Janeiro, where he spent time between races. He had personal aircraft. He kept multiple road cars. He donated substantial money to Brazilian charities, particularly to programs serving poor children. This is documented in the history of what later became the Instituto Ayrton Senna, founded by his sister Viviane. The wealth was real, and by his own account in interviews, it mattered to him less as an end in itself than as a measure of what he could do for others. His rivalry with Alain Prost, the French driver who was his teammate at McLaren from 1988 to 1989 and his closest competitor throughout their careers, was one of the defining sporting antagonisms of the era. They crashed into each other deliberately, or semi-deliberately, at the Japanese Grand Prix in both 1989 and 1990. In 1989, Senna was disqualified after the incident. Prost won the championship. In 1990, Senna drove into Prost at the first corner of the Japanese race to prevent Prost from winning the title. Senna won the championship. There were official inquiries. There were accusations. There were interviews where both men said things about the other that were not diplomatic. The FIA, Formula One's governing body, fined Senna and put him on a suspended ban. The feud between them was genuine, not manufactured, and it lasted years beyond the point where they were teammates. What was also real, and this is where the shadow begins to enter, is that Senna's relationship with the sport was not uncomplicated. He was intensely religious, Brazilian Catholic in his practice, and he spoke openly in interviews about experiencing what he described as transcendent states while driving, moments where he felt he was no longer consciously controlling the car. He said this in 1988, after qualifying at Monaco, in one of the most frequently quoted passages in motorsport history, that he was going faster and faster, and the gap between himself and God was narrowing. These were not metaphors to him. He meant them as literal descriptions of his experience. He also carried something darker, which people close to him documented only later. The sport he loved was killing people, not abstractly, concretely, and recently. In 1982, Gilles Villeneuve had died at Zolder during qualifying. Riccardo Paletti had died at Montreal during the race start. In 1986, Elio De Angelis died during a test session. The cars were faster every year. The tracks, many of them designed decades earlier, had not kept pace. Senna knew this. He had known it since he entered the sport. He discussed it with other drivers. He had been pushing since 1993 to revive the Grand Prix Drivers Association specifically to address track safety. By late 1993, the FIA had announced a series of regulation changes for the 1994 season designed to slow the cars down. Active suspension, traction control, and other computer-assisted systems that had made the cars more controllable were being banned. The cars would be physically faster, more powerful engines, less aerodynamic downforce, but technically less forgiving. The drivers would have to work harder to keep the car on the circuit. Senna, in documented interviews from that period, said he was concerned. He was not alone. But the regulations went through. Then the weekend at Imola began. And it began badly before Senna's car ever moved toward the Tamburello curve. On May 1st, 1994, at 6:37 in the evening local time, at the Hospital Maggiore di Bologna, the doctors made it official. Ayrton Senna da Silva was dead. He had arrived by helicopter with no measurable brain activity. The medical team worked for hours. There was nothing to work with. The forensic pathologist, Nello Martini, of the Institute of Legal Medicine in Bologna, later signed the official autopsy report. The cause of death was severe traumatic brain injury. A fragment of the steering column had penetrated the helmet at the moment of impact, entering the right side of the skull, fracturing the temporal bone, and driving into the right frontal lobe. He had been clinically dead since the car stopped moving. Everything that happened between 2:17 and 6:37 was the world refusing to accept what the body already knew. Back at Imola, the race had been restarted. It finished. There was a podium. Michael Schumacher stood on it. The sport kept moving because that is what the sport does. The world did not keep moving. In Brazil, it was still afternoon when the news broke. People stopped their cars on the streets of São Paulo. Stores closed without announcement. In the neighborhood of Santana, in the northern zone of the city where Senna had grown up, someone hung a Brazilian flag from an apartment window within the hour. Then another. Then another. By nightfall, the flags were everywhere, and they were not at full mast. The Brazilian government declared 3 days of national mourning. Schools were dismissed. The stock exchange opened the next morning and immediately dropped. Economists later estimated the psychological impact on consumer behavior in the days that followed was measurable, not as a metaphor, as a data point. The country stopped functioning normally for 72 hours because a man most of them had never met had died doing something they watched him do every 2 weeks. His body was flown back to Brazil on May 2nd. The aircraft landed at Guarulhos International Airport in São Paulo. Thousands of people were waiting outside the perimeter. The coffin was draped in the green and yellow of the Brazilian flag. His mother Neide and his sister Viviane were there. So was his brother Leonardo. The family had been in contact with the hospital in Bologna through the night and into the morning. Ayrton Senna had reportedly known the truth early, that her son was not coming back in any meaningful way. But the official pronouncement came at 6:37, and that is the number the world recorded. The funeral was held on May 5, 1994, in São Paulo. The coffin was carried through the streets on a gun carriage, a military honor reserved in Brazil for heads of state and figures of national significance. Approximately 3 million people lined the route. That is not an estimate rounded for drama. That is the figure cited in official records and corroborated by aerial photography. 3 million people stood in the streets of São Paulo to watch a racing driver's coffin pass. For context, São Paulo in 1994 had a population of approximately 9 million. 1 in 3 people in the city was on the street that day. The procession took hours. People threw flowers. Many of them wept openly. Some had painted their faces in the national colors. Some held photographs. Some held nothing and just stood there, which in its own way said everything. Alain Prost was there. Damon Hill was there. Frank Williams sent a representative. The Formula One world showed up because it understood, if belatedly, what had happened to it. He was buried at the Morumbi Cemetery in São Paulo, not far from the hospital, where he had been born 34 years earlier. The legal and financial reckoning that followed was complicated and took years to resolve. Senna's estate at the time of his death was estimated at between $300 and $400 million. An extraordinary sum accumulated through race winnings, endorsement contracts with companies including Banco Nacional, Tag Heuer, and a range of Brazilian and international brands, and investments managed across multiple countries. He had been one of the highest paid athletes in the world. His primary beneficiary under Brazilian law was his family. His parents, Milton and Nede, and his siblings Viviane and Leonardo, were the principal inheritors of the estate and the rights to his name and image. Viviane Senna, his older sister, took on the most visible public role. Within months of his death, she founded the Instituto Ayrton Senna, a non-profit organization dedicated to Brazilian public education. In the 30 years since, the institute has reached, by its own accounting, millions of Brazilian children through partnerships with public school systems across the country. The name that had been worth hundreds of millions in endorsements was redirected, not entirely but substantially, toward classrooms in the country that had claimed him as its own. The commercial value of the Senna name did not diminish after his death. It grew. Licensing agreements, documentary rights, merchandise, museum exhibits, and the continued broadcast of his races have generated revenue every year since 1994. The 2010 documentary, simply titled Senna, directed by Asif Kapadia, reached audiences in dozens of countries, won a BAFTA award, and introduced his story to an entire generation that had not yet been born when the car hit the wall at Tamburello. Each new generation discovers the footage of him in the rain in Monaco in 1984, cutting through the field like the weather did not apply to him, and the discovery is always the same: shock, then disbelief, then something harder to name. The Tamburello curve itself was rebuilt after the accident. The corner that had existed for decades, a flat-out left-hander with no room for error, was converted into a chicane, a deliberate slowdown, specifically because of what happened on May 1st. It is slower now. It is safer now. You can visit it. People do. They leave flowers, sometimes helmets, sometimes small Brazilian flags at the edge of the track. On the anniversary, there are always flowers. The broader safety changes that followed Senna's death, and the death of Roland Ratzenberger the day before, on April 30th during qualifying, reshaped Formula One permanently. Cockpit protection was redesigned. Track barriers were rethought. The role of the FIA medical delegate was formalized and expanded. The era of drivers dying at Grand Prix weekends, which had defined the sport's first 40 years, effectively ended after Imola 1994. There has not been a driver fatality at a Formula One race weekend in the decades since, a record that would have been unthinkable in Senna's early years when losing 2 or 3 drivers a season was an accepted reality of the sport. The price of that change was the two men who died at Imola. The sport built its modern safety record on what it could not afford to ignore any longer. In the spring of 1994, a ticket to see a Formula One race at a circuit in Europe cost somewhere between $50 and $100, depending on the venue and the grandstand. A replica Senna helmet, the kind sold in merchandise tents at circuits, cost roughly $30. Today, an authentic race-used Senna helmet sells at auction for between $200,000 and $500,000. A signed photograph goes for thousands. Even a printed program from a race he attended commands prices that would have seemed like a misprint in 1994. The $30 helmet in the merchandise tent has become a financial instrument. The man who wore the real one never knew any of this was coming, which is either a comfort or the saddest part of the whole story, depending on how you look at it. What is not debatable is the scale of what was lost. Not just for Brazil, not just for racing, but for the specific and unrepeatable thing that he was. A driver who operated in a zone that his competitors described, without embarrassment, as something beyond what they could explain. Alain Prost, who fought Senna for years and despised him at various points and respected him at others and understood him better than almost anyone in the paddock, said after the funeral that there are drivers and then there are phenomena, and Senna was the second thing. That is a statement from a man who had every reason to be measured in his praise. He was not measured. He meant it. Somewhere right now, a 22-year-old is watching the footage from Monaco in 1984 for the first time. The way the car finds grip where there is no grip, the way he threads through the spray between the barriers with margins that look like errors until you realize they are not errors. They are precision at a scale that looks like accident, because the human mind cannot immediately process that someone is actually doing that on purpose. That 22-year-old is feeling something they don't quite have words for yet. And somewhere right now, someone who was alive on May 1st, 1994, who was maybe 20 years old in a college dorm room, watching a grainy feed on a television that got 3 channels, or maybe 35, and watching in a sports bar in Chicago or Houston or Boston, is feeling the exact same thing, watching the exact same footage, knowing exactly how it ends, and unable to stop watching anyway. The 22-year-old doesn't know yet what it means to watch greatness and lose it in the same moment. The 50-year-old knows. They were there. They watched the car leave the track in real time, on a Sunday afternoon, and the world changed while the race kept going. That is the thing about Ayrton Senna. He did not disappear quietly. He did not fade. He was there, fully, completely, at the absolute limit of what a human being could do in a racing car. And then he was gone, at 2:17 in the afternoon, on a Sunday that 300 million people were watching. The world did not learn about it later. The world watched it happen. And that is why, 30 years on, the footage still stops people cold. Not because it is sad, though it is, because it was real, because it happened in front of everyone, and because the man who died on that track had spent his entire life driving towards something that no barrier was ever supposed to reach, and for 34 years, nothing had.